Next up, I'd like to welcome Kevin Oakes. So Kevin's here. I'm hoping he's over there, getting my tell. So Kevin is the CEO and founder of the Institute for Corporate Productivity. Kevin and I have had a long meandering kind of relationship. We competed with each other for a long time. Kevin was right at the ground floor when the e-learning industry first started. He was the founder of Sum Total Systems. He was the CEO of Click to Learn, and then Docent. So all of these names that form part of the history of our industry, Kevin has his fingerprints all over them. And between he and I, we as I said, we competed and known each other and become friends over the years. So not only being that role that he's played in learning, he has been chair of ATD. He's obviously a well-known speaker and panelist. He is the author of the Executive's Guide to Integrated Talent Management, so just an all-round good guy. So Kevin's going to share the secret formula for organization agility. Kevin, thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Mark, for a very nice introduction. And kind of inspired by your comments yesterday, I want to start out with a little confession. So my name's Kevin, and I created learning management software. And I'm sorry. I didn't invent learning management software. I did run an LMS company, of course, and that's how Amar and I know each other. But for the last 10 years, I've actually been doing good for the world. And I've been running a company called the Institute for Corporate Productivity, which I'm guessing some of you may not know what that is or what we do. So let me give you just a quick background on us. We're basically a research organization, and we're all about the people practices that drive high performance or market performance in an organization. Now, that term, high performance, is one I tend to use a lot in my presentations. So I want to define what I mean by it, what we mean by it, when we talk about high performance. And what we're really referring to are companies that have better revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction than their competition. And so what our team of analysts does on a pretty regular basis is looks out at companies that have that criteria, and what are they doing differently with their human capital practices versus low-performing companies. And we look at what are they doing differently and what specific practices are correlated with market performance overall. And so we're working with a lot of Fortune 500 well-known companies. You can see some of the logos here. And one of the aspects that I just love about high-performing organizations is the culture of those organizations. And so it's kind of fun to hear the number 3 teams talk about culture before. Because culture is a very amorphous, very difficult thing to sometimes define. And so I want to talk about the importance of culture for a quick second. And I want to start with just a little story. So several years ago, back in 2009, I had 2 meetings here in Silicon Valley. One in the morning, one in the afternoon. And so the first meeting, I walked in to the company, we'll just call it for now, company number 1. And it was a big, long marble hallway of the headquarters of this building with nobody in the lobby whatsoever, and I could hear my shoes kind of echoing as I walked down this lobby. And at the end of the lobby was a receptionist. I won't comment on that receptionist, but there was a receptionist at the end of the lobby who, called into the person I was meeting with, and that person came back and got me and took me behind the closed doors to just a sea of cubicles where people generally had ties on, and this was a technology company, so I thought that was kind of weird. But it was all very, very quiet. And they were all speaking in hushed tones, as we walked back to this conference room. And as a result, I felt like, well, we need to speak in hushed tones because we don't want to upset the cubicle farm that's out there. So that was a little interesting experience. So then, I got lunch. I then went into company number 2, and I walked into the lobby. And it's a glass lobby, and there's plants all over the place. And people are coming and going, and they're laughing. I think I even saw people in bathing suits jumping up and down, just having a fantastic time. It was clearly a very different experience. I felt the same thing when I went behind the closed doors and back to, where everybody was working. Everybody seemed to just be really enjoying themselves. So I like talking about that because I always question, does culture translate into performance? And had I invested in those two companies at that moment, on that day, this is roughly what would have happened to my investments. So the top line is company number 2, and the bottom line there is company number 1. Now some of you might guess who these companies are, but company number 2 was Apple, and I wish I invested when I walked out of that lobby. Company number 1 was Hewlett-Packard, and to be fair to HP, Adrian is following me on the stage today from HP. So I warned him ahead of time and said, hey, I got a little story I'm going to tell. I hope you're cool with it. He's like, yeah, that's fine. HP knew they had cultural problems back, 7, 8 years ago, of course. And they've become a much different company now, and they've split, and he works for HPE. But the general notion of what would have happened had I invested in those companies remains about the same. Now let me give you another example. So I live in Seattle, and obviously Microsoft has a big presence in Seattle. And I've been fascinated by the cultural transformation that Microsoft has undergone really a couple times, since I've been in Seattle. Now, under Bill Gates, they were thriving. They had a great culture, and the performance followed. And I think one of the things that Bill Gates was always very good at was what we're going to talk about today, which is agility. If you remember, back in 1995, when Microsoft came out with Windows 95 at the time, they had big parties all over the world, all over the country. I remember going to one of those parties, and the Rolling Stones, was blaring through the speakers, and it was a big deal. But at the same time, Microsoft was under attack from the internet. They really, were caught a little flat-footed by Netscape and a number of different companies that they weren't quite sure what to do with. And Bill wrote this memo that you see here. I think he typed it himself on a 1940s typewriter, but it was called the Internet Tidal Wave. And he basically told the entire company, if what you're doing is not webized, is not going to be put over the web on the internet, then stop right now and make it so. And he basically turned a very successful company into an even more successful company by doing that. Now, if you project ahead to when Ballmer took over, and I don't want to just place this all on Steve Ballmer's shoulders because he was running a much, much bigger company at the time, but he really got, and the company really got caught flat-footed by a number of things. Never saw Google coming, and Google being the powerhouse that it was. Didn't see Apple creating the products that they did. Microsoft's own attempts at mobile, for example, were kind of a joke, and they just weren't an agile company at all. Now, I've been very impressed since Satya Nadella has come in as CEO, and for the first time in really well over a decade, I'm seeing Microsoft employees are excited about the future. They're excited to be working for the company. And what Satya has done is create a culture that really does embrace change and embraces agility. And he's relying on this woman to help him. And this is the CHRO of Microsoft, Kathleen Hogan, she's a friend of mine. She is working hand in hand with Satya to really try to transform overall the culture of Microsoft. And they've done it by embracing the concept of growth mindset. And we've heard that term used many times already in this conference. What Kathleen and what Satya and all the executives have done is taught the concept of growth mindset to the employee base. And so if you see that sticker that's on the right-hand side, that is something that's in every single conference room now in Microsoft. And it says, is this going to be a fixed mindset meeting or a growth mindset meeting? And if you can read what it says under fixed mindset, they give examples. You know, it leads to a desire to look smart and therefore have a tendency to give up easy, see failure as fruitless or worse, ignore useful negative feedback, feel threatened by the success of others, and avoid challenges. Is that the kind of meeting we want to have? Or is it a growth mindset meeting, which leads to a desire to learn and therefore a tendency to persist in the face of setbacks, see failures as essential to mastery, learn from criticism, find lessons and inspiration in the success of others, and embrace challenges with agility? I love that sticker, and I love the fact that Satya has been such a great proponent of growth mindset and of a learning culture and organizational agility. Now, let's look at the stock price here too. Does culture translate into performance? This is roughly what's happened to Microsoft's stock since Ballmer announced he was leaving and Satya was taking over. Now, you can also argue a chicken or the egg thing here too. Certainly, employees are happy when their options or their warrants are in the money, of course, and doing well. But certainly, their stock has performed very well, and they think it's really all about the cultural change they've done inside the organization. So as a research company, we study these things. We study culture, and we've looked at a number of KPIs around culture. And through a couple of different studies have shown there are 5 culture KPIs that really matter the most. And you can see where it says LPO, that means low performing organization. Where it says HPO, that means high performing organization. Excuse me. So if you probably can't read what's on the left there, but those 5 areas are, is this perceived as a good place to work? Do we respond well to market changes? Do we have a readiness to meet new challenges? Do we have shared organizational values? And do we have the ability in the culture to change? Now I love that because as I read through those KPIs, it's really all about organizational agility. And organizational agility is something that I see more and more executives and more organizations focused on because they recognize that the market is changing incredibly fast. Their ability to be competitive is how quickly they can be agile and change with the changes in the market. It's easy to pick on Blockbuster, but predicting the future is not that easy. You can read this 1999 quote that was in one of their analyst reports that the investor concern over the threat of new technologies is overstated. And Blockbuster is a very black and white kind of example about a company that just did not respond well or quickly enough to changes in the marketplace. And so now Blockbuster is gone. When 20 years ago they were everywhere, and Netflix obviously is thriving. So things change very quickly. In fact, if you look at who are the most valuable organizations 20 years ago versus 10 years ago versus today, the most valuable organizations are all technology companies, where largely they were not 10 and 20 years ago. Things change rapidly, and as a result, companies are being created all the time. If you look at the unicorns, private companies with $1 billion or more valuation, the unicorn club has gotten pretty damn crowded over the last few years. Look at how many companies have popped up into this $1 billion valuation range as private companies over this time period. It's no wonder that a Microsoft or other companies will say, damn, we have to be agile if we're going to survive long term. And this is really what a CEO thinks about. How can I get my company to be proactive and anticipate change instead of being purely reactive? And how can I create a more flexible, decisive organization that responds effectively to and embraces change rather than approaches it with fear or skepticism? And how can I get everyone to impartially evaluate performance on business metrics and plan accordingly? In short, how can I be more agile as a company? So we did a report just a little while ago called The Secret Formula for Organizational Agility. And I'm going to give you the secret now, and the secret formula for how to be agile. But first, let me just give you a couple stats. almost 2/3 of companies over the last 2 years say they have experienced disruptive change. In fact, many of those companies haven't just experienced one change, they've experienced multiple changes. Over 60% of companies have experienced, in a year time frame, 3 to 6 changes. Most of the companies that have experienced those changes are high-performing organizations. So this doesn't just happen to low-performing organizations, this happens to some of the top companies out there. And so as we looked at what are the dimensions of agility overall, we came up with 6 things that highly agile companies really do well. They sense and adapt to change, they absorb the impact of change and respond to and act upon it, they anticipate change, and then they exploit and take advantage of it. And when we looked at high versus low performing companies and how they rated themselves in each of these categories, the ones that really stood out was not only responding quickly, but exploiting or taking advantage of changes in the business environment. And that to me is one of the hallmarks of high performing organizations. They don't sit around and reactively go, oh no, change is happening, how are we going to manage it? They not only exploit it, but they sometimes induce change. And you see this in some top companies where they like to shake things up, keep people on their feet, keep them on their toes, constantly reorganize. I used to work at Fidelity Investments many, many years ago, and they would reorganize every 6 months. They're just constantly shaking things up. And you'll see that in very highly agile companies, where change is not viewed as something that they dread, it's viewed as something that's exciting and as an opportunity. Now, how many of you read that IBM recently asked all the remote workers to go back into the office? Did you read that? I bet when you first read it, you were like me, like, what a bunch of idiots. I can't believe they're making their workers go back into the office. Didn't they learn anything from Yahoo and the bad press Yahoo got around, got for that, etc. But IBM is a smart company. And I knew there was probably more to the story. And so I talked to their CHRO, Diane Gerson, about what they were doing with this edict. This was all about agility. And they're now starting to talk about it. That they, in their own research, have determined that if they're going to be highly agile as a company, they need to co-locate. And they were finding it very difficult for remote workers to spontaneously have innovative conversations with other workers, spontaneously come up with new ideas when they were remote, because you always had to schedule time, and it's hard to schedule innovation sometimes. And innovation is a big key to agility that I want to talk about in a second. IBM thinks they are 100% agile as a company, and what they're doing is taking agile software development principles and putting it into business agility. And they want to be as committed to business agility as they are to agile software development. And they're really embracing what we determined were 5 shared organizational values that drive agility. And I want to go through each one of these, but I want to show you why we found these as so critical to driving agility. So innovation, transparency, creativity, diversity, and collaboration. High agility organizations all say that they are those things to a much, much greater extent than low-performing organizations. In fact, when they say they do all 5, I should say, they're 10x more likely to be agile than low agility organizations. Now the first one is a very important one, and that's innovation. And I've done entire presentations on innovation. We've got studies on how you can create and foster a culture of innovation inside the organization. Clearly, high-performing organizations feel like they're more innovative. They're 2 times more likely to define and promote organizational values related to innovation. They're 5 times more likely to have a culture that encourages innovation and fosters trust. And I love this last one. 1 in 5 highly agile organizations acknowledge that their culture supports risk-taking and embraces failure almost 10 times more than low agility firms. And this is something that a lot of companies don't do well. They do not look at failure as something that is a learning opportunity. I love that sign. Failure is an opportunity for you to learn. And there's a number of organizations that I think are good examples around celebrating failure. So how many of you have a can of WD-40 in your house? Yeah, everybody pretty much. Anybody know how that name got created? Oh, hardly anybody ever gets that part, but that's good. So WD stands for water displacement, which is the technology that WD-40 is created on. But the 40 is the 40th attempt to get that product right. So there was a WD-38, 39, and then they came out with WD-40. Their CEO, we had him speak at our conference a couple years ago. Really interesting guy because he talks about failure very openly and talks about risk-taking very openly inside the company. In fact, on a regular basis, their managers get together and they tell the whole company about the biggest mistakes they've made in the last quarter. Now think about that, getting a whole bunch of managers together and just talking about mistakes that they made with the employee base. How often does that happen in organizations today? I did a whole panel one time of chief learning officers where that was the focus of the panel, was we talked about what's the biggest mistake you made in your career. It was awesome. I want to do it again. Because one of the panelists actually started crying. The mistake that was made in that person's career was just so emotional to that individual. You all know Angry Birds. That seemed like it kind of popped up overnight. Well, that was 8 years in the making, 52 versions it took to create that before they finally got it right. And then the Dyson vacuum cleaner, 5,126 prototypes were made before they released that to the market. Great products often have a lot of failures before they become great. And so it's important when you're talking about innovation to create an environment where it's okay to take risks and it's okay to fail and to talk about that failure openly. So we asked companies, do you think innovation is important? And also, how effective are you at innovation? And it's interesting that high and low market performers both think innovation is pretty critical. But look how low the low market performers rate themselves on being effective at innovation overall. So 4x difference between high and low market performers. Some traits of those innovative cultures: they celebrate new innovations all the time. They celebrate rather than punish intelligent risk-taking, and the intelligent part is probably important. You don't want people just willy-nilly taking risks, but you do want them to looking at intelligent risk, calculated risk. They reward leaders who are adept at encouraging innovation. They strive to reduce barriers to innovation, and they have a learning culture that freely shares knowledge. And for this audience, that's a critical component. So last year I did a presentation on how to create a culture of learning. And we showed that top market performers are 5 times more likely to have a learning culture than companies who have not as good revenue growth, not as good profitability, etc. And when we looked at the traits of a learning culture, it really revolved around user-generated content and active knowledge sharing permeating the organization, learning being an espoused organizational value, leaders at all levels involved in teaching others. And we talked about this briefly yesterday. I think that's one of the quickest ways to get a learning culture, is to start getting your leaders involved in a Leaders as Teachers program and get them teaching on a regular basis. You will quickly create a lot of advocates for L&D inside the organization. Learning being reinforced in hiring and leadership development, the organization measuring learning's effectiveness, managers who are rewarded for mobility and development. Talent mobility is one of the least used tactics, I think, for development of employees inside of organizations. Very few companies are good at talent mobility. Very few companies recognize or reward managers for their ability to move talent, and very few companies measure that. It's one of the things that we call out as a next practice that companies should really look at. And a culture of learning is really about 4-way accountability between the organization, the learner, the manager, and the leader. All of those things I think are critical to having innovation and being an agile culture. But the second one on that list is transparency. And I often get asked, hey, you talk to a lot of high-performing companies, what's common amongst those companies? And this is the first thing I say, is high-performing organizations tend to be very transparent. They're very clear in their communication. They have frequent communication, but there's really not a lot of secrets in high-performing organizations. Creativity is another one. And in the report, we call out Citrix as being a company that really goes above and beyond in creating an environment that inspires creativity amongst their workforce. Creativity and innovation obviously go hand in hand, but highly agile organizations value creativity 4 times more than less agile firms. The fourth is diversity, and we do a lot of work in D&I. Diversity of thought is so important when it comes to innovation. Homogeneous environments don't produce great ideas typically because everybody thinks the same way. But we call out BASF as a company that really is embracing diversity from an agility and innovation perspective. And then the fifth one is collaboration, and just really having the ability to exchange that knowledge on a regular basis, but valuing collaboration from a leadership perspective and employee perspective. We feel so strong about collaboration. We've partnered with Rob Cross. Some of you probably know Rob. He was at University of Virginia. He's now at Babson. And he had a cover story at HBR last year called Collaborative Overload. It was one of the most read HBR articles that they've ever put out. And so we're building on that article, and I'm sure if I asked, have any of you ever felt collaborative overload? You would have a lot of hands raised in this room. But that's what's happening to some of your high performers, your high potentials. They are getting overloaded with all the different communication systems that they've got inside their organization, inside the organization. And so what we're doing is trying to look at how do collaborative, excellent companies operate? What do they do to make collaboration excellent, and what do they do to prevent collaborative overload? So just a couple of takeaways. Get ahead of the market with future-focused processes. Include those 5 things that we listed as organizational values in your values. Celebrate mistakes, don't punish failure, and make knowledge sharing an organizational priority. Now we run a group of chief human resource officers, and they feel so strongly about the importance of organizational agility and what they can do as an HR team to change that they asked us to go do more research on this particular topic. And so that's what we're doing right now. We've been interviewing many Fortune 500 CHROs around this topic. We're doing a survey. We're going to produce results in a few months and then unveil the full report in March timeframe. So if anybody's more interested in this topic in organizational agility, let me know. So I think I've run out of time, so I won't take questions on stage, but I love this Dilbert, by the way. I think it sums up the human capital industry pretty well. Love to answer any questions that you have offline. This is a topic that I just think really connects the human capital space with business results, and we can really do a lot to make our organizations more agile overall. So thank you very much.